I want to talk to you a little bit this morning about what it means to walk in kingdom promise or to inherit the promised land. And we do a lot of talking about the promised land. This is, I think, from an angle that I haven't taught on before, out of some texts that I haven't used previously in talking about this. But I believe it's important for people to recognize the promises of God in their life and learn how to apprehend them and be apprehended by them. And not just stop at the mere wonder of what it might be like if you get there one day, but realizing that God has intended a purpose and a plan for your life, and it's a continually unfolding one. You know, we look for this one moment where it's like, oh, we've arrived, and realizing that there's continual promises that God has for us that we are in continual pursuit of, that we both pursue. It's this strange paradox of both pursuing and inheriting, if that makes sense. Because in many ways in the kingdom, it is that. There is much that we inherit by way of grace, but there's also much that we receive by way of pursuit. It's like a marriage. You know, when I'm married, I'm married. So are you married? Do you have it? Yes, I have it. But there's also a pursuit inside of that covenant. Does that kind of make sense? So it is with God. I think we tend to put these things in boxes and think, okay, well, if God has it for me, then I'll just have it, and it just is. And yes, there's a measure of that. But there's also things that God begins to hide so that we can discover. Right? We've talked about this. We've talked about that it's the glory of God to conceal a matter and the glory of a king to search it out. So there is a joy that comes inside of the place of discovery that comes on the heels of your pursuit. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the beginning stages of that process. So we're going to be at the end of Genesis chapter 11, and then we're going to do the beginning of Genesis chapter 12 in the few minutes that I have with you. So Genesis 11, verse 27. Say amen when you're there. Amen. You ought to get there fast now. Everybody's got smartphones and such. So y'all it's just like, you're like 3 clicks away. Boom, boom. Okay. So this is the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still living. Meanwhile, Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. But Sarah was unable to become pregnant and had no children. One day Terah took his son Abram and his daughter-in-law Sarai and his grandson Lot. Are y'all following all this? This is some genealogy for you, which it'll be important in a moment. And moved away from Ur and the Chaldeans. And he was headed to the land of Canaan, and they stopped at Haran and settled there. Notice, Terah lived for 205 years and died still in Haran. Then I want to read verse 1 of chapter 12 to you. The Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, talking about Terah, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make you famous, and you'll be a blessing to others. And so we'll unpack that some more in a minute. But I want you to see that we have this moment where Terah, so this is Abram. Are we familiar with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? So this Abram is going to be renamed Abraham eventually, so we understand who we're talking about here. So Abram's father, Terah, lived among this idolatrous people, and these were the Chaldeans or the Chaldeans, depending on what way you want to pronounce that. And what happens is they're living in this land for an extended period of time. And God tells Terah, hey, we need to take you into the promised land, go to Canaan. So Terah begins to take his family, he uproots his family, his sons and his sons' wives, and he says, we're going to go to Canaan. And on his way to Canaan, we find out that somewhere along this story, he loses his son Haran. So Haran is Abram's brother who has now died. Now in this day and age, this would be an extremely young death. Very, very young death. In fact, this would be a premature death for Haran to die at such a time as this. However, there is this invitation from the Lord to go to Canaan. And what we find out is in this process is Terah goes to Haran and remains there. So Haran now is not just a person, but it's also a place. Because in the scriptures, names have great meaning. And so what happens is Terah, I'm getting Haran and Terah mixed. So Terah comes in and gets lost and held captive by his own loss. So in other words, when he loses his son, he finds himself incapable of going to the promise. And this is something we have to be so careful of, is realizing that there is so much that God wants to do in your life, right? There's so much that God desires to take you and to build around you and to do through you and to do alongside you with other people. God's desires and heart for you is good. It's great. It's amazing. It's more than you can ask, think, or imagine. Do you get it? It's big. It's huge. It's Canaan-sized promises that God has for you. But what happens along the way is as we go, as we get our word and we start moving towards where God has us, we experience loss. And if we're not careful, that loss will cripple us and we will settle in a place that was never designed for us. We will get disappointed. We will lose people along the way. And it's disheartening because just as Haran was the heart of his father and his father wanted him to be there, right? He desired him to go. He was unable to make it. And there are things and places that you're going to begin to go and to accomplish and inherit in the earth. And I'm telling you right now that not everybody you know that is with you now is going to make the journey. I wish that were not true. But there are people in your life that will simply not make the journey. I'm not saying that they won't get there eventually, but I'm saying they may not enter the promised land the same time you do. Because they are not as yielded to the process or committed to the promise as you are. So we see this happen with Abram as God says, you know what? Now I'm going to need you to leave your family and go to Canaan. At this time, Abram was only 75 years old when he gets this promise. But it says that his father remained there over 200 years. Do the math. So Abram has to leave his father in his loss because he lost his ear and heart for the promise in order to inherit what God gave him. God wanted more for the entire family, but only a select few had an ear to heed it and follow it through. And I'm telling you, there is something in your life, if you're going to begin to inherit all that God has for you, it's going to require a level of persistence and pursuit that is not going to happen by a haphazard, casual approach to what God has in your life. And one of the things that we have to guard our hearts for is the disappointment of loss. Many of us have experienced that in leadership in our life or other people in our life and things like that. And you understand when I say loss, I'm not just talking about a physical death, right? It's the things that you really have been, you see this in people's lives where they really hope for something and they desire something and they want to see God come through and they push and they push and they push. And before long, when they don't see it, they get weary. And disappointment and hopelessness just settles in their heart. And before long, what they now thought was a promise, they've now negotiated down. To say, oh, well, God, maybe God didn't want that for me. We see this happen doctrinally all the time. It's like here at this church, we believe, and you've heard me say this countless times, that Jesus should get everything that he paid for. He said, you'll do the same works I did and even greater. But here's the problem. When people in a pure heart with pure motives try to see the things that Jesus did in their lives and they don't see it happen, over a period of time, if you're not careful in guarding your heart against disappointment, you'll start to renegotiate whether that was even available. And so now we have entire doctrinal and theological circles that are cessationalists. It's like, well, God doesn't do that anymore, right? This was just for this dispensation, this era, this time. He was into it then to try to validate the apostles' teachings and so on and so forth. But today we don't really do that. Now he's just aloof, he's afar off, he's out there, but he's not really actively engaging in people's lives anymore. And there's this great book that'll get you, has some good moral codes. If you can just really grit your way into it and follow that, then you'll do okay and you'll make it into the pearly gates. And I'm just not interested in that. I'm really not. I think there's some great things about that story because I think it's a big deal that God gives us clear lines of how to live in holiness and righteousness. I honor the word. All that stuff is good. Yes, and there is more. But if we're not careful in guarding our heart against the disappointment and loss, the times that we miss it, the times that things do not come out the way that we wanted them to, the way that we desired for them to, against our best intentions, against our best efforts, if we don't guard our heart against that loss, what we will do is we will settle in Haran. We will settle in loss, and we will live and we will die there. And the reality is that you were designed for Canaan. That's where God wanted you to ultimately arrive. But if you don't have an ear to hear and a heart to pursue, you will ultimately forfeit and abort everything God has designed for you to have. So Genesis 12:1, I'm going to read that verse to you again, and we're going to go down and read quite a number of verses, just giving you a heads up, okay? Did you miss it on your Bible reading this week? Don't answer. We're going to make up just a little bit. The Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. Notice that God's the one doing this. I will make you into a great nation. We always want to make the nation ourselves. Anyways, I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on the earth will be blessed through you. Why are you blessed? To be a blessing. We're not in the hoarding business. Right? That's why even when we when and you know I'm one of those people that don't talk about money a lot, because I've kind of responded to people's over hypersensitivity to it. Does that make sense? Which is not entirely good, right? Because it's still a good principle and it needs to be taught. We need to live it. But one of the things you'll notice Miranda says when she talks about giving, and I'm not talking about money, right? But I'm just using money as an illustration, is the fact that we're doing this for kingdom living. Nobody's getting rich off of this. I promise you I'm not getting rich. I promise you none of our volunteers and leaders are getting rich off of this. We have complete transparency about everything that we do here at this church. And at any time you can say, well, what are the financials? And if you're a member of this church, you can receive those financials. My point in saying that is this, is the reason why God blesses us and blesses house and desires you to be blessed is so that you can bless other people. It's not to hoard up. It's not to be great in your own sense. Listen, we're called to be lenders and not borrowers, right? I'm not against having nice things. Just don't let nice things have you, and we're okay. So that's what we're beginning to see, that God's desiring for Abram is to be a blessing so that others can be blessed. It says, all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran, and he took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all his wealth, his livestock, and all the people who had taken into his house in Haran, and headed to the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There was, and that's not talking about oysters, in case you're wondering. When I read that, I was like, are you shucking them? But anyways, so the dad jokes are thick up in this joint. Okay, y'all hanging in there? Cool. So there he set up a camp beside the oak. At that time, the area was inhabited by the Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. All right, 2 more verses. You hanging in there? After that, Abram traveled south and set up camp to the hill country with Bethel to the west of Ai. To the east, there he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord. Okay. So I want you to begin to see in this moment that God is sending Abram to Canaan. But notice something, is Canaan is currently inhabited by the Canaanites. Why is this important? Because in our mind, when we think Canaan on this side of the cross, everybody's first mind goes to, it's the promised land, right? The land that overflows with milk and honey. It's this great thing that, man, we read Genesis, we read Exodus, we're reading Deuteronomy, and it's all about journey to Canaan. That's over and over and over again. It's this great thing, this great promised land that God has for people. But what we forget is the story of how Canaan became Canaan. Before Canaan was a promised land, Canaan was a person. Canaan was actually the offspring of Ham. Ham was one of the sons of Noah. Are you following me? Tell him I said, what's up? So, That's got a solid ringtone. It's got some funk to it. That's better than that hotel stuff, you know? All right. So let me see if I can track you back. You ready? So before, it was about to get good. It's about to get good. So before Canaan was the promised land, it was a cursed land, and it was a cursed land because of a cursed man. This man was cursed through the action of his father Ham. Ham was the son of Noah. So we have Noah had 3 sons, right? Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And what happened is after they get off of the ark, Noah does what any man would do after being stuck on an ark with his family for 40 days and 40 nights with nothing but his in-laws and animals. He builds a vineyard. And he overindulges. He shouldn't have done it, but that's what he did, okay? But the first thing he says, I'm building a vineyard. So he builds this vineyard, he overindulges, and it says, and I'm going to keep this as PG as I can, but Ham defiled him. Ham defiled him. It says that Noah woke up and had realized what had been done to him. Okay? So we don't know the specifics, but we know whatever it was bad, so much so that when his brothers came in, they walked in backwards and covered their father. Okay? So this is a bad situation. So when Noah realizes what has happened to him, he doesn't say, cursed be Ham, his son. He says, cursed be Canaan. Canaan, as I just told you, is Ham's offspring. Why is this important? Because you have to realize that one generation's compromise will always be the next generation's captivity. What you begin to do in moderation, the next generation will do in excess. And so it's important to remember that the things that we do in life do not just affect ourselves, but it affects the people around us. When you make a decision or a series of decisions with your life, I know in this Americanized idea that it's just about you, but friend, it's not just about you. There are people that you are called to impact whether you're aware of that or not. In fact, we just read before this that Abraham was to be, and at this time he's still Abram, but Abram is to be blessed so that he's a blessing to the entire earth. It says all of the families in the entire earth will be blessed by what God does in one man. So do you think what God does in you is a big deal? And do you think that the things that we do in our life or not do, because I'm telling you right now, your no is just important as your yes. I know in religious circles, they're obsessed with teaching you how to say no. I'm trying to fix that by teaching you how to say yes, because if you learn how to say yes to the right things, I'll never have to teach you how to say no, because you'll lose an appetite for everything that's inferior to what you're saying yes to. But what we see is that before God sends Abram to Canaan, we have to trace back its footsteps of how did Canaan get here. And Canaan got here as a cursed land through a cursed man. And the reality of the situation is that God rarely will just allow you to discover a promised land. Most of the time, He wants you to recover one. We love the idea of discovering promise because it's all teed up, set up, ready to rock and roll. But in the reality of the kingdom, what generally happens is it's not that we're discovering promise, but recovering it. In other words, we're taking what was cursed and we're now going to see it blessed because of our agreement and pursuit with the Lord. And so we have to get out of this mentality that God's just going to drop everything nice, neat, and perfect into our lap, and all of the problems in our life are going to be fixed as soon as we said, in Jesus' name. What God does after the in Jesus' name is give you the seed to plant, to watch, steward, and grow until the promised land becomes the full, mature promised land it was designed to be. And it happens in every way in your life, in every area of your life, every relationship that you have, your workplace, your local church, your communities. If you want to begin to see those things be great, because I talk to people all the time who have big dreams. And they have big visions, and they have all these things they want to see God do. Or even they have their own, even for folks that aren't in their religious circle, but just have these passions and missions, and things they want to accomplish. And the first things I usually hear is like, well, you got to think about, what the market is like here. And if this is going to work here, and if you were in a bigger city, this is going to be more easy. Right? If you want to see God move in miraculous ways, you've got to go X, Y, Z. It's never where they currently are. They've always got to go somewhere. They've always got to move. And I understand that there's a little bit of tension here because we realize that Abram is going from a place to a place, but realize the place he's coming from is no better than the place he's coming to. But the reason why God was calling him to Canaan is because it's always in God's heart to restore anything that is lost. Because you have to realize, in the origins of this, Ham would have been responsible for a third of the earth. There's only 3 sons. He would have been responsible for the third of this geographical area that now he's called to steward and now is underneath the curse. So what God did was find a man who he would qualify to redeem the things that were lost and forfeited. Is this starting to sound familiar? You're starting to see the similarities between this and the message of Jesus. And what he does is he come back and he restores what is lost. He recovers what is lost and reconciles it back to the Father. I think something else that is rather interesting about this is the fact that not only do you have this similarity here between the 3 sons, right? So you have Ham, Shem, and Japheth responsible for the third of the earth, but then you think about the similarities when it comes to the heavenly dimensions, and we have Gabriel, Michael, and Lucifer. And then we have Lucifer, a worshiper, fall, and then it says a third of the stars fell. Now, we can get into to the theology of this if you want to. There are some people that would try to make the argument that that's talking about fallen angels that now we call demons and all this other stuff, and I don't want to get into demonology and all that stuff with you right now. Here's the point that I want to settle with you, is that there was a being that was created for a particular purpose that fell, and there was a third that was lost. And his primary position was to be a worshiper. And isn't it now a little bit ironic that what God does as our primary pursuit of relationship is now he's come and found a people who are now worshipers. Those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. That Jesus comes and recovers those things for us. And so now what God is looking to do in the hearts of and lives of the people that he comes and resides in by way of faith in Christ is to come and recover all of those things in life. God's not looking for you to find another area in your life to pivot and just find grass that's already green. You with me? He's looking for a people that he can send to a wilderness desert place and turn it into an oasis. But the real reality of this is it's going to take real pursuit. It's going to take real work. It's going to take a real genuine burning desire. And most of the days that when you wake up, it's going to be difficult and it's going to be tough. And I'm telling you, that's the pleasure of the call. See, a lot of us look at the great benefits of people who are highly successful, but we don't want the responsibility of it. You know, you talk about the people who have, let's just talk about financial success for a moment. You talk about business owners, even some of those in this room, and you see that maybe they have some financial freedom or this, that, and the other, and they seem to have nice things, and they can go on vacation and all this other stuff. And you look on the outside of all these people who really seem to be hitting it off well, and you're like, oh man, that must be nice. You know, oh, it's really good for them. They're doing really great. And what you don't see is the 60, 70, 8-hour work weeks that they put in. You don't consider the $500,000, $1 million of debt, of risk that they took on to get there, right? You didn't consider all of the things that they do when you're sitting back eating your Doritos watching Netflix and they're tucked away in a corner at 1 o'clock in the morning punching away trying to get the numbers to add up. You know what I mean? And what you've now seen is on the heels of 2 decades worth of work for them to enjoy what they've done, and you think they just got there. See, a lot of us want the success, we want the outcomes, we want the great relationships, we want beautiful marriages, we want our children to grow up and just be great contributors to society and represent God well. And the reality is that happens in the day-to-day grind of being committed, of pursuing one another, of doing the work every single day to see that happen. You grow the promise. The promise doesn't just, I hope that's so clear to you, because I do not want you to think this is some bait and switch. That you come to church, you find Jesus, and all of a sudden you're never going to run into anything hard again. And I'm telling you, in many cases, it does get better. It gets easier because now you're doing the difficult thing with increased power and grace and peace and comfort, right? If you're doing it with the Lord, not in self-effort. So all those things are great and good. But for me to sit here and tell you it's not going to be difficult, for me to sit here and tell you you're not going to have to walk through challenge to get there, for me to tell you that God's not going to sometimes plant you in a place that doesn't want you, with people who aren't interested in your mission or your vision or your goals or your dreams or what it is that you want to accomplish and your idea and strategy for how you're going to reclaim and restore the land, okay? I promise you the Canaanites had zero interest in what Abraham's mission was. Zero interest. Did not care. What is it, iota? Is that a thing? Did I say it right? All right. I'm working on my Georgianese still. I'm a Georgia native and still don't have it down. So, but this is the things that God is calling us to, guys. We've got to see that what God is wanting to do in us means that we're going to have to go through and press through the hardship. We're going to have to guard our heart against the losses of life and realize that God is calling us to reclaim and recover things that are lost, not just for the nice things to fall right in our lap. And I think the other thing that is important to understand how this happens is realize the story of Abram. And so you realize that Abram eventually becomes Abraham. So he's supposed to be more than a father, right? But he's supposed to be the father of nations. But the issue is when you have a father who is so gripped and rooted by his own disappointment and loss, he will never have a vision for the potential and promise that you were meant to inherit. And so his father could never identify him appropriately. And I think a lot of times in life, we yield our own identities and our own purposes to the people around us that don't have the vision for what God put in you. They don't have the ability to apprehend the greatness that God's called you because they can't see beyond your past. They can't see beyond your limitations. They can't see beyond your own personal struggles. And to be really honest, if they were to be honest with you, they can't see past their own disappointment. And because they didn't see God do it for them, they're thinking, well, there's no way God's going to do it for you. Because listen, I started out just as fiery and excited and with all the zeal. I remember my first year pursuing the Lord, everything was great. And I was, praying and praying for people and all this other stuff. And I'm telling you, within a few years, it all dissipated. Right? And so what they'll say is, just give it a little time. Give it a little time. It'll simmer down. I remember there were people in my life that told me that early on. I remember being a teenager just really excited about what God was doing. It's like, oh, just give it a little time. You'll settle down. And the reality of that is there's disappointment that has settled in the place of the heart that causes hopelessness. And you can never have appropriate vision when your heart is conquered by hopelessness, because if you have hopelessness, you don't see the one who generates all hope. If you have hopelessness and disappointment, it's because you haven't seen Jesus. And if you haven't seen Jesus, you don't have right vision. If you don't have right vision, you can never identify, let alone yourself, much less the people around you. And so you'll always shackle the people around you if you don't allow the Lord to conquer your heart and begin to deal with those disappointments. And so what Abraham has to do in order to begin to walk in the fullness of what God has for him is God starts with renaming him. He's like, you know what? I need you to re-identify yourself and see yourself rightly before you can ever steward the promise. Until we fix the way that you see yourself and see your calling and see your destiny, you will never carry what I give you rightly. And so before Abraham becomes the father of many nations, which is what his new name means, is he has to walk around for 2 decades calling himself something he's not living up to. Can you imagine this? Abraham is walking around saying, what's your name? Abraham. Well, they know what that means. Father of many nations. What do you mean father of many nations? You ain't even conquered Canaan. You don't even have offspring, dude. Like you're almost 100 years old and you don't even have a kid and you're walking around calling yourself father of many nations. How delusional must you be? That's what religion will tell you. And that's what people will tell you. As you walk around with what God has renamed you as, and you carry that in your life, and when you don't see it on their time frame, they'll start telling you how it's not going to happen and how you need to readjust your expectations and perspective. And my question to you is, to what? To what? If God be true, let every man be a liar. If this is something that God has spoken over you and what God has released in you, then you have to hold on to that no matter what. In fact, we find out in this story, when Abram goes to Canaan, it says it's struck with a famine and he has to go back to Egypt. So he's like, God, you said go to Canaan. I went. It's struck with a famine and I'm forced to go back to Egypt. In other words, right then in that moment when we would feel like God said, go do X, then we go do it, and X did not pan out at all, we would think, yeah, I didn't hear God right. Right? Because you base your hearing God on the physical evidence that you see around you. It had to be perfect, it had to be right, and if it wasn't God. Where'd you get that idea from? Did the Father send Jesus? Okay. How did that work out for him? On paper. On paper. Did it look great? No. Rejected, abused, eventually murdered. I mean, one of the shortest ministries I've ever heard of, 3.5 years. On paper. And then you realize, those who have an ear to hear realize he accomplished the greatest thing anyone could ever accomplish. But it takes a spiritual eye and a spiritual heart to begin to see those things come to life. It takes someone who will walk around for 2 decades of where most people would get disappointed, someone who would still walk away and have the audacity to say, no, I'm the father of many nations. I know you don't see my children yet, but the Lord gave me this word. The Lord gave this to me and spoke this over me, and I will see it happen because he is faithful and just to make sure that he completes every good work that he begins. And this is who this God is. And what's amazing is that Abraham counted God as faithful, having never stepped foot into Canaan and inherited the land. Why? Because his offspring did. He thought that as long as his offspring had done it, it's the same as him receiving it. That requires such a generational consciousness that is beyond your self-narcissism, that the only way you'll begin to sow the way that you're meant to sow, the only way that you will radically serve the way that you're meant to radically serve is realize that what we're building is greater than ourselves. It's going to outlive us. It's going to go far beyond what it is that we can personally contribute, and it's all about setting up the next generation for what it is that we believe God wants to accomplish. That every promise doesn't have to be achieved in my own lifetime. I'm telling you, there's promises that I have in my heart that there is just, it's going to take generations. But some of us stop dreaming that big because we'll only have the faith for what we think we can accomplish, which tells you how little we believe in the people we're leading. And if you don't trust and believe in them, how do you expect them to believe well? Because what will happen is you'll go around calling them Abram when they're supposed to be called Abraham. And so this man has to wait over 100 years to be identified appropriately to even start his journey. Imagine how different his life would have been if he had had a father that could have seen who he was called to be earlier than that. Imagine the strides he could have taken earlier that now he was set back because the generation before him did not have the vision. What we have to begin to see is apprehend the vision that God is giving for us as a people, as a church, and as a community. What are the things that God is calling us to reclaim? Not just waiting for God to just make it happen. You want to, we would love a church that had great resources to make real impact, to feed the hungry and help the mental health crises and to rebuild community relationships and deal with homelessness and housing issues and all of the things, right? Like I would love to be able to do all those things. And you look around and you say, well, how are we going to do that? There's just, 80 people, 70 people in a room. How are we going to accomplish this? And the way that we do it is we have one person at a time giving God their complete yes. And we begin to say yes every moment of every day. And we start reclaiming what it is that God has set aside for us. Instead of waiting for someone else to do it or waiting for God to just make it happen, we realize that God has put the mandate on your life. Why did God give you the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead if He didn't expect you to use it? He wants you to use the power and the love and the kindness and the generosity and all the things that He is in your life to see these things happen. But instead, we read the Bible, we come to church, and we say, oh, well, God has these things, set aside for us. It's really great. And then we go home and pretend like Sunday didn't happen. I don't know. It's like, what are we doing? And we just expect this stuff to just occur out of thin air. And the moment we talk about, well, here's an opportunity that we can do X, or why, and you're like, well, I've got 100 other things I got to do. I'm really busy. I've got this. My schedule's a little tight, and it's like, with what? What are you busy? And I'm not trying to say that what you have going on in your life is not important, but it goes back. What I'm saying now doesn't make sense to you if you were not here last week, because last week we talked about kingdom-mindedness. We have to make this shift in the place of the heart and mind about what our real and purpose and intention is in the earth. What has God called us to? And everything in our life has to be rearranged around that reality. Abram had a lot of things he could do, but his primary call was reclaim Canaan. Does that mean he couldn't have livestock and build wealth? No. Does that mean he couldn't have kids and do this and do that? No, he could do all the things. He could have all the things. But everything was meant to serve the main thing. And if our lives, if all the things in our life are not meant to serve the main thing, right? And when I say the main thing, you understand what I'm talking about here. I'm not one of those narcissistic, egotistical leaders that say, well, you got to sow into my vision and your local church. You know what I mean? That's not what I'm saying. But you know what God has called for you to do and what God is inviting you to do. And so God is expected that we take those things and we put everything that we have towards it so we see God begin to grow it. Everything we have in life is meant to be used as a tool to support what it is that God is calling. But if you want to see a plant grow, you got to let some seed go, friend. And you understand when I say that, I'm not talking about money. Money's a part of that, but I'm talking about your time. I'm talking about your intention. I'm talking about those people that you believe have just been going through the same cycle and over again, and they're not worth it. And it's like, no, you need to take time and sow seed there too. You need to love there. You need to be generous with your time there. You need to begin to speak hope over that person. This is bigger than, right? Are we catching what I'm putting down? Are we picking up what I'm putting down? Because until we start living this thing out, James says, without work, your faith is dead. And this is not a works thing. We understand grace. It's all grace. It's faith and alone and all that other stuff. But I'm telling you, when you have faith and you're conquered in love, Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. Works comes on the heel of appropriate adoration. And what you think is work becomes pleasure when adoration is right. If there are things that you know God is calling you to do and you just see that as pure work and there's no adoration and there's no joy in it, then you have a right to question how well are you rooted in love. I think for a long time, like I've had the thought that like, okay, if somebody asked me, it's like marriage is work. I bet, yeah, marriage is really work. You got to put a lot of work into it. And though I think there's a measure of truth to that, I think it's inadequate for the reality of the situation. It's this: when you have an appropriate adoration and love and care for that person, anything that is needed to be done in order for that relationship to flourish actually becomes a pleasure. The reason why it's not a pleasure is you're still preferring yourself over your spouse. And the scripture teaches us preferring one another in brotherly love. So we prefer one another in doing that. So when love is right, what used to be work now becomes pleasure. Are y'all having fun? Yes. You glad I'm wrapping up now? You're like, all right, we're getting a little too close to home. But I use the marriage example because the scriptures even talk about us being the bride of Christ. So we have to understand, so it is with God. If we just see everything as it relates to the local church mission and what it is that we want to accomplish, it's just work. I got to go grind some more. I got to do. And it's like, you're not in love, friend. And it's great to have the discipline and obedience, and it's a great place to start. Okay? I'm not spinning off on that. But don't stop there. There's so much more. It gets better. It does. If you allow yourself in the place of the heart to be conquered in that love and adoration for the Lord. Okay? So stand with me. So 3 big things I want you to get is if we're going to acquire the promises of God in our life, we're going to have to persist beyond our past, beyond our challenges, beyond our perceived limitations. Our promised lands are usually recovered, not just discovered. So there's real work that has to go into that. But that work becomes pleasure when love is rooted in our heart. And lastly, in order for all these things to happen, we're going to have to become everything that God has designed us to be. We're going to have to make our transitions from our illegitimate identities of Abram to walking into our real identities of Abraham. You understand that metaphorically? Is that we allow people and things and mistakes to create all these ideas about who we think we are, and before long, those become handcuffs and shackles. And I'm telling you, you were born for greatness. You were born for greatness. You are a beautiful people with beautiful purpose, with amazing things of God on your life. To have any thought to say, well, I'm not capable, or I'm not worth, or I'm not whatever, is to say that God is incapable or capable of creating something that has little worth. That's not true. That's not true. God is incapable of creating something that has little to no value. Every person in this place has tremendous value and tremendous purpose. And we are all dependent upon one another to become all that God is calling us to be. Because whether you like it or not, my destiny is actually connected to yours. Why? Because we're family. We're family. As much as you would like to think it's just about you, it's not. As much as you'd like to convince yourself that your resistance is only affecting you, it's not. It's affecting everyone else around you. And it's great because when you're going through the difficulty and you're going through the challenge, you've got a room full of people who are ready to lock arms with you. Because you are not meant to do this on your own. Notice Abram at the time did leave some of his family behind, but he also took some things with him. So let those who have an ear hear. Let those who have an ear stand up and say, you know what, we're going to inherit the promises of God in our life. And we're committed to that process, whatever it looks like, whatever it sounds like. However long it takes, it doesn't matter. God has my yes.